Sarah Mitchell gave her last homemade meal and freshly harvested vegetables to a homeless stranger who hadn't eaten in 3 days. This selfless act left her pantry empty and put her upcoming mortgage payment at serious risk. But when a sleek motorcade of luxury vehicles pulled into her dirt driveway the following afternoon, Sarah discovered her small act of compassion was about to change her life in ways she never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn straw hat as the morning sun beat down on Willow Creek Farm. At 48, her face was etched with lines that told stories of early mornings, late nights, and years of battling unpredictable weather. The 12-acre vegetable farm had been in her family for 3 generations, but now Sarah was the last Mitchell still working the land. Fresh picked this morning, she called to a passing car, but it continued down the country road without slowing. Sarah sighed and checked her watch. It was already noon, and she'd sold only 2 small bags of tomatoes. The roadside stand built by her mother 25 years ago stood as a reminder of better days when cars would line up for Mitchell's famous heirloom vegetables. The past 4 years had been merciless. First came the unusual frost that wiped out nearly half her crop. Then a blight affected several rows of her oldest tomato plants. Last year's drought had been the worst hit, leaving the vegetables smaller and fewer. Sarah had been forced to let go of her 2 part-time workers, leaving her to manage the entire farm alone. Just need to make it through one more season, Sarah muttered to herself as she sorted through the stack of bills. The mortgage payment was due in 5 days, $1,200 that she simply didn't have. Without making that payment, she risked foreclosure proceedings on the farm that had been her family's legacy for generations. Sarah glanced at the photograph of her late husband, Michael. He had passed away 4 years ago after a sudden heart attack. The medical expenses and funeral costs had depleted their savings, and Sarah had been forced to refinance the farm twice. Michael had always handled the books, making sense of their finances even in the toughest times. Without him, Sarah felt adrift, clinging to the land that had been her family's legacy. Despite her troubles, Sarah took pride in her vegetables. When the occasional customer stopped, she would explain the different varieties with genuine enthusiasm. "These Cherokee purple tomatoes are perfect for eating fresh," she would say. "But if you're making a sauce, you might prefer these Rama varieties." The locals appreciated her knowledge and the superior taste of her organic produce. By mid-afternoon, sales had trickled in slowly. A young couple bought a bag of bell peppers and a jar of Sarah's homemade pickles. An elderly woman purchased 3 tomatoes, apologizing that she couldn't afford more on her fixed income. Sarah insisted she take a 4th tomato at no extra charge, something Michael would have done. If she sold everything at her stand and had a good weekend at the farmer's market, Sarah might scrape together $400, still $800 short on the mortgage payment. The bank had already been patient, extending her deadline twice. Missing this payment would mean starting foreclosure proceedings, and without the farm, Sarah's future looked bleak. To supplement her income, Sarah delivered specialty boxes of organic vegetables to a few local restaurants that valued farm-to-table produce. The Riverside Grill had been her most reliable customer, but last week the owner had regretfully informed Sarah that they were switching to a cheaper supplier. Corporate. Bottom line, the owner had explained apologetically. Nothing personal. Her 2001 Toyota pickup groaned as she drove back to the farm after her deliveries. The transmission had been slipping for months, but Sarah couldn't afford to fix it. She'd become an expert at coaxing the vehicle along, knowing exactly when to ease off the gas on hills and how to jiggle the key just right when the ignition stuck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm as Sarah returned to her stand. The highway that passed her farm had once been the main route to Riverdale, But 4 years ago, a new bypass had diverted most of the traffic. Only locals and the occasional lost tourist now passed by Willow Creek Farm. Sarah arranged her remaining inventory: 4 crates of tomatoes, 6 jars of pickles, and 3 small bags of mixed vegetables that Michael had taught her to prepare for busy customers. The weekend farmers market would be her last chance to make the mortgage payment, but she needed these roadside sales too. Every dollar counted. As the sun began its descent, Sarah watched the empty road with fading hope. The weekday traffic had never fully recovered after the bypass, but lately it seemed even the locals were shopping elsewhere. The new supermart on the outskirts of town offered cheaper produce shipped in from large commercial farms across the country. Another hour passed with no customers. Sarah was about to pack up for the day when she noticed a figure walking slowly along the roadside. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the man walked with careful steps, his shoulders hunched slightly as if carrying an invisible weight. The stranger's measured pace suggested he had been walking for some time. As he drew closer, Sarah noticed his disheveled appearance, clothes that had once been good quality but were now worn and dirty. His face was partially hidden by an unkempt beard, but his eyes remained alert, scanning his surroundings with cautious awareness. Despite his obvious state of homelessness, there was something in his bearing that suggested he hadn't always lived this way. Sarah straightened her vegetable display, not out of hope for a sale, but from an ingrained sense of pride in her product. She'd greet this traveler just as she would any potential customer, regardless of whether a purchase seemed likely. Michael had always said that kindness cost nothing, and in these difficult times, Sarah clung to his wisdom like a lifeline. The stranger approached Sarah's stand slowly, his movements cautious as he navigated the uneven ground. Sarah noticed the man's weathered face and the distant look in his eyes, a look she had seen before in people who had suffered significant loss. Despite his obvious fatigue and disheveled appearance, he carried himself with a quiet dignity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Afternoon, Sarah called out with a welcoming smile. Beautiful day for a walk, though seems like you've come quite a ways. The man nodded, stopping at the edge of the wooden stand. Name's David, he said, his voice rough but steady. David Harrington. Been on the road since sunrise. Sarah extended her hand. Sarah Mitchell, this is my farm. They shook hands, and Sarah noticed calluses that didn't match what she'd expect from someone living on the streets. These were older calluses, the kind formed from years of work. Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking? David's eyes scanned the horizon before answering. Job prospect in Riverdale. Construction company that's hiring. My situation's been complicated lately. He gestured vaguely to his appearance. Riverdale's another 8 miles from here, Sarah said. You planning to walk the whole way? Don't have much choice, David replied with a shrug. Interviews tomorrow morning at 10. I'll get there. Sarah watched as David eyed the vegetables displayed in neat rows. The stranger's gaze lingered on them a moment too long before he looked away. Sarah recognized the look, hunger mixed with pride. These heirloom tomatoes are the best in the county, Sarah said, picking up a particularly beautiful specimen. Care to try one? David shook his head. Just looking today. Need to stretch what little cash I have. What did you do before? Sarah hesitated, not wanting to be insensitive. Before I ended up like this? David completed her thought. Without offense, I was in finance. Senior investment advisor for Westfield Partners in the city. He straightened slightly as he spoke, as if remembering a different version of himself. Sarah nodded respectfully. Must have been quite a change. Market crashed, firm collapsed, divorce followed, then medical bills, David said simply. It's amazing how quickly it can all unravel. Sarah's eyes met David's, a flash of recognition passing between them. My husband used to say the same thing. We never know how close any of us are to losing everything. Sarah noticed David's hand trembling slightly as he reached to steady himself against the stand. When was the last time you ate something substantial? She asked directly. David hesitated, his pride visibly wrestling with honesty. Had some crackers yesterday morning. Been rationing what I've got left. Without a word, Sarah reached behind her stand and pulled out the lunch container Michael had taught her to always prepare, a habit she couldn't break even 4 years after his passing. She made one each day, as if you were still there to remind her to eat properly. Here, Sarah said, holding out the container of homemade vegetable stew and cornbread. I've already eaten. David shook his head. I don't take handouts. It's not a handout, Sarah insisted. It's one human being to another. Michael, my late husband, would kick my butt from beyond if I let you walk away hungry. A small smile crossed David's face. After another moment's hesitation, he accepted. The container. Thank you. Sarah turned away, giving David the privacy to eat without being watched. She busied herself rearranging tomatoes while David devoured the meal in quick, efficient bites. That hit the spot, David said when he finished. I appreciate it. Sarah nodded, then made a decision. She grabbed one of her empty cardboard boxes and began filling it with vegetables. Take these with you for energy on the walk, she said. I can't pay for those, David protested. Not asking you to, Sarah replied, continuing to select the best vegetables from her display. Consider it fuel to get you to that interview. An investment in your success. David watched as Sarah added more vegetables to the box. That's your livelihood you're giving away. Sarah paused, looking at her nearly empty stand. The mortgage payment loomed in her mind, but something stronger, something Michael would have done without hesitation, pushed her forward. There'll be more vegetables tomorrow, she said simply. Plants are still producing. This wasn't entirely true. The drought had significantly reduced her yield, and these vegetables represented a good portion of what she had harvested that morning. Every tomato she placed in that box was another $1 she wouldn't have toward her mortgage. Payment. David seemed to sense Sarah's generosity went beyond what she could afford. Just a couple will do, he insisted. Sarah ignored him, adding a jar of pickles and a bag of mixed vegetables to the box. The mixed veggies are good for quick energy. And they travel well. My husband's recipe. Was your husband the one who taught you to give away your inventory to strangers? David asked, a hint of a smile softening his weathered features. Sarah chuckled. Michael would have loaded you down with enough food to feed an entire shelter. He never could stand to see anyone hungry. As Sarah handed over the box their eyes met again. In David's gaze, Sarah saw not just gratitude but recognition. One person who understood struggle seeing it mirrored in another. I don't know what to say, David admitted, balancing the box carefully. Good luck with the interview. Sarah replied, That's all the thanks I need. David nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn business card. If you're ever in need, this is my former colleague's contact information. He still works in finance. Good person. Sarah accepted the card, tucking it into her shirt pocket without looking at it. Safe travels, David. As David turned to leave, Sarah called out, Wait. She disappeared into the small storage shed behind her stand and emerged with a bottle of water. Hydration is important. It's another 6 miles to the next gas station. David accepted the water with a nod of thanks. I won't forget this, Miss Mitchell. Sarah, she corrected. And I'd do the same for anyone who needed it. Sarah watched as David continued down the road, his stride slightly more energetic now. That he had food in his system. The box of vegetables and the water bottle would add weight to his journey, but David carried them as if they weighed nothing, the posture of a man accustomed to much heavier burdens. As David disappeared around The bend, Sarah turned back to her stand. The once full display now held only a handful of tomatoes and 2 jars of pickles. She had given away nearly everything she had brought to sell that day. An older couple pulled up in a sedan, regular customers who stopped by every Thursday for their weekly supply of fresh vegetables. Sarah greeted them with her usual friendly smile, though her stomach knotted at the sight of her nearly empty stand. "Light day, Sarah?" the woman asked, surveying the sparse selection. "Just been busy," Sarah replied, not wanting to explain. The couple, living on a fixed retirement income, purchased only 3 tomatoes instead of their usual dozen. "Sorry, Sarah," the man said. "Social Security check doesn't stretch like it used to." "No worries," Sarah assured them. "These 3 are on the house today. Consider it a thank you for your loyal business." The couple protested but eventually accepted her generosity with grateful smiles. As they drove away, Sarah tallied her day's sales, $32.50, not even close to what she needed. The sun was setting as Sarah packed up her remaining inventory. A few cars had slowed as they passed, but seeing the meager selection, they had continued on without stopping. Sarah couldn't blame them. As she loaded the last crate into her truck, her phone rang. It was Jim from the bank. "Just checking in on that payment, Sarah," Jim said, his tone apologetic but firm. "Manager's writing me about outstanding accounts." "I'll have it by Monday," Sarah promised, though she had no idea how she would make good on those words. "Just need the weekend market to come through. Monday's the absolute deadline," Jim warned. "After that, we'll have to start foreclosure proceedings." Sarah ended the call and leaned against her truck, the weight of her financial situation pressing down on her like a physical force. Without the farm, she had nothing. She drove home in silence, the truck's transmission whining in protest as she climbed the hill to her farmhouse. The evening light cast long shadows across the fields, turning the rows of vegetables into silhouettes against the darkening sky. As she prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, Sarah found herself replaying her encounter with David. She didn't regret giving away the vegetables, not really. Michael would have done the same and would have insisted on it. Some things were more important than money. Still, as she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if her kindness had been foolish. The mortgage payment loomed, and now she had even less produce to sell at the weekend market. Sarah glanced at the photograph of Michael on the wall, his smile as bright as the day they'd married 22 years ago. "What would you do, Mike?" she asked the empty room. The answer came to her immediately, exactly what she had done. With that thought providing a small measure of comfort, Sarah finished her meager dinner and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she could rest knowing she had done right by a fellow human being in need. Some victories, Michael always said, couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Sarah awoke before dawn the next morning, a habit ingrained after decades of farm work. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain, weather that would keep customers away from both her roadside stand and the weekend farmer's market. She sighed as she peered through the kitchen window. The forecast had predicted sunshine, but Mother Nature had her own plans. "Just what I need," Sarah muttered, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The bills spread across her table hadn't magically disappeared overnight. If anything, they seemed to have multiplied in the darkness, their urgency more pressing in the gray. Morning light. She'd spent half the night calculating and recalculating her finances. Even if she harvested every ripe vegetable in the fields today and sold every last one at the farmer's market tomorrow, she'd still be short on the mortgage payment. The bank had been patient, but Jim's call yesterday made it clear their goodwill had run out. Sarah pulled on her work boots and rain jacket. Clouds or not, the vegetables needed to be harvested. Her old joints protested as she knelt in the first row, carefully selecting ripe tomatoes. Without help, the harvesting took twice as long. But Sarah couldn't afford to hire anyone, not even the high school students who used to work part-time during harvest season. The first raindrops began to fall as Sarah filled her second crate. By the third, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour. She continued working, ignoring the water trickling down her neck beneath her collar. Each vegetable represented potential income she desperately needed. By mid-morning, Sarah was soaked through, her hands stiff with cold. The rain showed no signs of letting up. She loaded the 5 crates she'd managed to fill into the bed of her truck and covered them with a tarp. Not a great haul, but it would have to do. As she drove toward her roadside stand, the wipers struggled to keep pace with the rain. Few cars traveled the road in this weather. Sarah's hopes for decent sales diminished with each passing mile. Setting up the stand in the rain proved challenging. Water poured off the small roof, creating a curtain that customers would have to push through to reach her produce. Sarah arranged her vegetables carefully, making the display look fuller than it was, then settled onto her stool beneath the meager shelter to wait. 2 hours passed without a single customer. Sarah's damp clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin, and her stomach growled. She'd been too preoccupied with harvesting to eat breakfast. She reached for a tomato, then hesitated. Each one she ate was one she couldn't sell. The memory of David Harrington flashed in her mind. The homeless man had been hungrier than Sarah was now, with fewer prospects for his next meal. Sarah had done the right thing, she was certain of that. Still, the practical consequences of her generosity were becoming increasingly apparent. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Anne, the coordinator of the farmers market. "Sarah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news," she began, "but we're canceling tomorrow's market." The Weather Service upgraded the forecast to a severe thunderstorm warning for the entire weekend. The field where we set up is already a mud pit. Sarah's heart sank. "Any chance of rescheduling to Monday?" "I wish we could," Anne replied. "But the property owner has another event. We're looking at next weekend at the earliest." After ending the call, Sarah stared out at the empty road. The market had been her last hope for making the mortgage payment. Without it, she was sunk. Around noon, the rain eased to a drizzle. Sarah spotted a familiar sedan approaching, the elderly couple from yesterday. They pulled up beside her. "Stand," and the woman rolled down her window. "Sarah Mitchell, you're going to catch your death sitting out here in this weather," she chided gently. Sarah forced a smile. "Just doing business as usual, Mrs. Jenkins." "Well, we need a few more tomatoes for our grandson's visit," Mr. Jenkins said. "He loves your Cherokee purples." Sarah selected 4 of her best tomatoes, placing them carefully in a bag. When Mr. Jenkins handed her a $20 bill, Sarah reached for change, but the older man waved her off. "Keep it," he insisted. "Those tomatoes are worth every penny." Sarah recognized the kindness for what it was. The Jenkins were on a fixed income but understood her situation. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing they wouldn't want her to make a fuss. After they left, the road remained empty. The rain returned with renewed intensity, drumming on the metal roof of the stand. By 3 o'clock, Sarah had sold only the tomatoes to the Jenkins, $20 toward a $1,200 payment. Her phone rang again. Sarah recognized Jim's number from the bank and considered letting it go to voicemail. Facing reality, she answered. "Sarah, Jim." Began without preamble. "There's a problem. The manager reviewed your account today. He's decided we can't wait until Monday for the payment." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "Jim, we've known each other since high school. You know I'm good for it." "It's not up to me," Jim replied, discomfort evident in his voice. "Corporate took over last month, and they've implemented strict policies. They're sending someone to post the foreclosure notice tomorrow morning if the payment isn't made by close of business today." "Tomorrow's Saturday," Sarah protested. They've got a weekend crew for foreclosures now, Jim explained. I'm really sorry, Sarah. I fought for you, but they wouldn't budge. After hanging up, Sarah sat motionless, the rain matching her darkening mood. Without the farm, she had nothing, no income, no home, no connection to the family she'd lost. The afternoon stretched on without another customer. By 5 o'clock, Sarah decided to cut her losses and head home. As she packed up the unsold vegetables, her truck made an ominous grinding noise, then stalled completely. Sarah turned the key repeatedly, but the engine wouldn't catch. Perfect timing, she muttered, popping the hood. Steam rose from the engine block, confirming what she already suspected. The water pump had finally given out. The repair would cost hundreds she didn't have, on top of the mortgage payment she couldn't make. Sarah pulled out her phone to call for help, then remembered she'd had to downgrade her cell plan. She no longer had roadside assistance, and a tow would cost more than she'd made in the past 3 days combined. With no other options, Sarah gathered her unsold produce and began the 2-mile walk home in the rain. Each step was a reminder of her mounting problems: the failed water pump, the impending foreclosure, the canceled farmer's market, the utilities coming due next week. Problems stacked upon problems with no solutions in sight. Lightning flashed across the sky as Sarah trudged up her driveway, her arms aching from carrying the crates of vegetables. Thunder followed almost immediately, indicating the storm was directly overhead. The farmhouse looked particularly forlorn in the gray deluge, its paint peeling in large patches, the gutter hanging loose on one corner. Inside, Sarah stripped off her wet clothes and changed into dry ones. The house felt unusually cold, and when she checked the thermostat, she discovered why: the power had gone out. She tried the lights to confirm, then rummaged in a kitchen drawer for matches to light the old kerosene lamp Michael had insisted on keeping, just in case. By the lamp's flickering light, Sarah made a simple dinner of peanut butter on stale bread. The power outage meant the small amount of milk in her refrigerator would soon spoil, another loss she could ill afford. As she ate, Sarah spotted the business card David had given her, still in the pocket of her now drenched shirt hanging by the door. She retrieved it, careful not to tear the soggy paper. Westfield Financial Advisors, it read, with a name, Harrison Wells Sr., partner, and a phone number beneath. For a brief moment, Sarah considered calling. Perhaps this financial advisor could help David secure that construction job. But with her phone service limited and her landline dependent on electricity, making calls would have to wait until morning. Sarah moved to the living room where faded photographs lined the walls, generations of Mitchells who had worked this land before her. Her grandfather clearing the first acre in 1945, her parents standing proudly beside their first substantial harvest in 1970, Sarah and Michael on the day they took over the farm, young and full of dreams for the future. "What would you do, Mike?" Sarah asked the photograph. Her husband had always been the problem solver, the one who could find a way through any challenge. Sarah had been the steady one, reliable but not particularly resourceful. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows. Sarah noticed a new leak in the ceiling, water dripping steadily into a pot she quickly positioned beneath it, another repair she couldn't afford. As she crawled into bed that night, exhaustion weighing down her limbs, Sarah tried to find some reason for optimism. She'd survived difficult times before, after Michael's diagnosis, after his death, after the first season of drought. Each time she'd found a way forward. But as thunder rattled the windows and rain seeped through unseen cracks in the old farmhouse, Sarah struggled to see a path through her current troubles. Without the farm, without reliable transportation, without the farmer's market, how would she survive? How would she honor the legacy of all those who had worked this land before her? Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by worries that multiplied like shadows in the darkness. In her dreams, Sarah saw vegetables rotting in the fields, the farmhouse. abandoned and neglected, and Michael's disappointed face as strangers moved into their home. The storm raged on through the night, as if determined to wash away what little hope Sarah had left. Sarah awoke to silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, creating patterns on the faded quilt Michael had given her for their 50th anniversary. For a brief, blissful moment, Sarah forgot her troubles. Then reality crashed back. Today was the day the bank would post the foreclosure notice. Without a miracle, Willow Creek Farm would be lost. She rose stiffly, her body protesting the previous day's labor and long walk in the rain. The power was still out, so Sarah heated water for coffee on the small propane camping stove she kept for emergencies. As the water warmed, she stepped onto the front porch to assess the storm's damage. The farm had weathered the deluge reasonably. Well, a few plants had been flattened, and some nearly ripe tomatoes lay scattered on the ground, but overall, the fields stood resilient. Sarah felt a surge of pride in their strength, followed immediately by a wave of shame that she might lose them, not to nature, but to her own financial failings. The driveway was another matter entirely. What had been a simple dirt track was now a rutted mess of mud and standing water. Sarah doubted even a four-wheel drive vehicle could navigate it without getting stuck. Perhaps that would delay the foreclosure agent. As she sipped her coffee, Sarah tried to formulate a plan. She could attempt to repair her truck, though the parts would cost money she didn't have. She could try calling Ann again to see if any other farmers markets were operating this weekend. She could contact the bank about restructuring her loans, though they'd been resistant to that idea during her last 3 attempts. None of these options seemed promising. Sarah was considering which of her few remaining possessions might fetch enough at pawn to cover at least part of the mortgage payment when she heard an unfamiliar sound in the distance. At first, she thought it might be thunder, remnants of the passing storm, but the sound continued, growing steadily louder. It was mechanical, purposeful, the unmistakable rumble of multiple engines. Sarah stepped off the porch, straining to see down the long driveway through the morning mist rising from the wet ground. She spotted movement. Vehicles, several of them, were approaching. The lead vehicle was unlike anything Sarah had seen on her property before, a sleek black limousine that somehow managed to navigate the muddy conditions, followed by 2 luxury SUVs and what appeared to be a news van. Sarah's first thought was that there must be some emergency. Perhaps the storm had caused more damage in the area than she realized, and these were disaster response vehicles. But as they drew closer, she saw no emergency markings, just the distinctive profile of high-end luxury cars. The convoy stopped about 50 yards from the house. The door of the lead limousine opened, and a figure stepped out. Even from a distance, Sarah recognized the upright posture and deliberate movements. "David?" Sarah said incredulously. David Harrington approached, but he looked markedly different from the homeless man of yesterday. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, his beard was neatly trimmed, and he moved with purpose and authority. Behind him, the doors of the other vehicles opened, and more people emerged. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," David called, a smile spreading across his face. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the convoy. "And it's Sarah, remember?" she added, almost absently, trying to process the transformation before her. David reached her and extended his hand, his grip firm, his eyes clear and focused. "Sarah, then. I told you I wouldn't forget your kindness." Sarah shook her head in confusion. "I don't understand. You were heading to a job interview yesterday. Now you're here with—" She glanced at the vehicles and the people assembling behind David. "What looks like half of Wall Street." David chuckled. "Not exactly Wall Street, but definitely a mission." He turned and beckoned to an elegant older woman who had emerged from one of the SUVs. "Sarah Mitchell, I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Harrington." The woman approached with efficient strides and extended her hand. "Ms. Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you." Sarah shook her hand automatically, still struggling to make sense of the situation. "Ma'am," she said, falling back on simple courtesy. In her confusion, "Elizabeth is my mother," David explained. When Sarah's bewilderment only deepened, Elizabeth smiled sympathetically. "Perhaps we should sit down and explain properly," she suggested. "Is there somewhere we could talk?" Sarah gestured toward the house, suddenly self-conscious about its shabby condition. "The power's out from the storm, but the porch is dry." As they moved toward the house, the door of the news van opened, and a woman carrying a camera stepped out, followed by a man with a microphone. Sarah stopped, eyeing them warily. "I didn't authorize any media," she said firmly. "They're with us," Elizabeth assured her. "But they won't record anything without your permission. They're here because we believe your story deserves to be told." Sarah frowned. "My story? Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't have a story worth telling. I'm just a farmer trying to keep her land." David smiled. "That's where you're wrong, Sarah. What you did yesterday, that was extraordinary." Sarah shook her head. "I gave a hungry man some food. Anyone would have done the same." "But not everyone did," David replied simply. "I walked 10 miles. Before I reached your stand, past dozens of houses and businesses, you were the only one who offered help without being asked." They settled on the porch, Sarah taking the old rocking chair while her visitors arranged themselves on the bench and steps. The others from the convoy remained respectfully by the vehicles, though Sarah noticed they seemed to be surveying the farm with interest. "Let me explain why we're here," Elizabeth began. "My son was not actually homeless, nor was he looking for construction work. You were testing me?" Sarah asked, uncertain how to feel about this revelation. "Not specifically you," Elizabeth interjected. "David has been conducting similar field assessments throughout the region, documenting how communities respond to those in visible need. Your response was exceptional." David leaned forward. "Mother, let me explain. 3 years ago, my father, Richard Harrington, passed away. He was a successful businessman but came from humble beginnings. He never forgot what it was like to be hungry and in need." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. "Richard believed that. True character is revealed in how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. In his will, he established the Harrington Foundation with a very specific mission: to find and reward extraordinary acts of kindness. The foundation has significant resources," David continued. "Each year, I travel anonymously to different communities, placing myself in positions of apparent need. I document genuine responses to my situation." Sarah stared at them both, memories flooding back. "So yesterday, when you came to my stand—" "I was completing my annual assessment," David confirmed. "I had almost given up hope for this region. Dozens of people had driven past or looked away. I was making my final observations when I reached your farm." Elizabeth reached into her bag and removed a folder. "When David told me about your situation and your generosity despite your own hardships, I knew immediately that you embodied exactly the kind of person Richard wanted to find." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "You're not saying—" "Willow Creek Farm has been selected as this year's recipient of the Harrington Foundation grant," Elizabeth confirmed. "We'd like to provide capital for modernization, labor from our agricultural training program, and guaranteed markets for your produce through our network of organic food distributors." Sarah sat back, stunned. This is too much. "You can't be serious." "We're very serious," Elizabeth assured her. "This isn't charity, Miss Mitchell. It's recognition of exceptional character. The foundation makes sound investments in people of integrity, people like you." David smiled. "Not just because of the vegetables, though your kindness is what brought us here. Having seen the farm and its potential, this is a sound business decision as well as a meaningful one." The proximity to the river makes the location ideal for our sustainable farming initiative, Elizabeth added. And the fact that this farm has been in your family for generations gives it special significance for our heritage preservation program. Sarah looked out over the fields her family had tended for generations. The plants seemed to stand taller in the morning sunlight, as if sensing a new possibility on the horizon. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll consider it, David urged. We have a formal proposal prepared with all the financial details and program specifications. Take your time to review it. One of the assistants from the convoy approached, carrying a leather portfolio. He handed it to Elizabeth, who passed it to Sarah. This is a lot to take in, Sarah said, accepting the portfolio. We understand, Elizabeth assured her. But there is one matter that might require immediate attention. David mentioned you're facing a deadline regarding your mortgage. Sarah grimaced. They're scheduled to post the foreclosure notice today. Can't make the payment. Elizabeth nodded to David, who pulled out his phone. With your permission, we can resolve that immediately. Consider it an advance on our partnership, should you decide to accept. Sarah hesitated, pride warring with practicality. I don't want charity. It's not charity, David said firmly. It's an investment in a person who has shown extraordinary character in the face of adversity. And it's a down payment on what we hope will be a long. Sarah thought of Michael, of what he would say in this moment. He had always believed that accepting help when truly needed was not weakness but wisdom. Michael would have laughed at Sarah's hesitation, would have told her to accept the good fortune with gratitude and put it to honorable use. All right, Sarah said finally, but I want everything properly documented, loans not gifts. I pay my debts, Elizabeth smiled. We wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Mitchell. As Sarah sat on her porch with Elizabeth and David, the rest of the convoy team began to move with purpose around the property. 2 men in business attire were examining the vegetable rows, taking notes on tablets and marking certain areas with small flags. Another group had gathered near the broken-down truck, inspecting it with professional interest. Sarah watched them, still trying to process the morning's extraordinary developments. The portfolio Elizabeth had given her sat unopened on her lap. I think I need that coffee now, she said, rising from her chair. Can I offer you both a cup? It's just instant, I'm afraid, with the power out. Don't trouble yourself, Elizabeth began, but David interrupted. Actually, I think that's been taken care of. He nodded toward one of the SUVs where an assistant was removing a sleek coffee machine and several thermoses. Within minutes, the assistant had set up an impromptu refreshment station on the porch, complete with gourmet coffee, pastries, and fresh fruit. Sarah accepted a steaming mug, the rich aroma so different from her usual instant coffee. Mrs. Harrington, Sarah began, taking a sip of the excellent coffee. Elizabeth, please. Elizabeth, Sarah corrected herself. You mentioned your husband believed in rewarding kindness. May I ask why this approach? The disguise? The testing? Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her son before answering. Richard came from nothing. When he achieved success, he was surrounded by people who wanted something from him. He became skeptical about human nature. Father believed that true character is revealed when no one important is watching, David added. When there's nothing to gain. He wanted to find people who were kind not because it was advantageous, but because it was right, Elizabeth continued. People whose instincts in a moment of choice lean toward compassion. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And the foundation, it's substantial? The Harrington Foundation controls assets of approximately $20 million, Elizabeth said matter-of-factly. Richard dedicated half his fortune to this purpose. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. And you're proposing to invest part of that in my small farm? Not just invest, David clarified. We want to establish Willow Creek Farm as the East Coast headquarters of our sustainable agriculture initiative. The property would remain yours, but we would partner to create a model farm and training center. A black pickup truck appeared at the far end of the driveway, struggling through the mud. Sarah recognized it immediately, Jim from the bank. "That'll be about the mortgage," she said, standing. David nodded to one of the assistants, who jogged down to intercept the truck. After a brief conversation, the assistant escorted Jim up to the porch. Jim looked bewildered by the presence of the luxury vehicles and well-dressed people. "Sarah, what's going on here?" he asked, eyeing the convoy. Sarah performed introductions, explaining briefly about the Harrington Foundation's interest in the farm. "So about that foreclosure notice," Jim began awkwardly. Elizabeth stepped forward. "That matter has been resolved. If you check with your office, you'll find the payment was processed this morning, including the full remaining balance on the mortgage." Jim pulled out his phone, made a quick call, and looked even more confused after hanging up. "They say it's paid in full with an additional goodwill donation to our community lending program." He turned to Sarah. "I'm glad it worked out. Hated the thought of foreclosing on your place." "I appreciate that, Jim," Sarah said sincerely. After Jim departed, clearly still puzzled by what he'd witnessed, Sarah turned back to Elizabeth and David. "You paid off the entire mortgage?" she asked. "Consider it an earnest deposit on our partnership," Elizabeth explained. She handed Sarah another document from the portfolio. Sarah read it carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "This says the foundation will settle all outstanding debts against the property, equipment loans, utility arrears, medical bills from Michael's care, clean slate. We want this partnership to begin without the burden of past financial struggles," David confirmed. Sarah shook her head. "That's too much. I can't accept that." "You can and you should," Elizabeth said firmly. "Not as charity, but as just compensation for what you've created here. You've maintained this land through impossible odds, preserved sustainable farming techniques that are increasingly rare, and continued to serve your community even when it cost you dearly." She gestured to the farm stretching out before them. "What we're proposing is not a handout. It's recognition of the true value of this property, not just in acres and crops, but in knowledge and potential. The training program we will establish here will help hundreds of people learn sustainable farming practices. Your expertise will be integral to that mission." Sarah looked out over the land her family had tended for generations. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by struggle and loss, but by growth and renewal. "Michael always said the farm was meant for more than just our family," Sarah said softly. "He had this vision of making it a place where people could learn, reconnect with the land." "Sounds like he would approve of our proposal," David suggested. Sarah nodded slowly. "He would." She turned to face them fully. "Before I give you my answer, there's something I need to show you both." She led them around the farmhouse to a small garden overlooking the fields. There beneath a massive old oak tree stood a simple headstone. "Michael," Sarah said, indicating the stone. "He wanted to be buried here, on the land he loved." Elizabeth stepped forward and placed her hand gently on the headstone. "Mr. Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you in this way," she said softly. "Your wife is everything you must have known she was." The three stood in silence for a moment, the breeze rustling through the old oak tree above them. "There's a tradition in my family," Sarah said eventually. "When a major decision is made about the farm, we announce it here first to those who came before." She took a deep breath, looking from the headstone to the fields below, then to Elizabeth and David. "I accept your proposal," she said clearly. "Willow Creek Farm will become a place of learning and new beginnings. Michael would be proud to see the land used this way." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah felt a weight lifting from Her shoulders, not just the burden of financial worry, but the heavier load of wondering if she could honor her family's legacy. For the first time in years, the path ahead seemed not just possible, but right. The days following the Harringtons' arrival passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Sarah feeling as though she'd stepped into someone else's life. Within hours of accepting the proposal, a team of electricians arrived to restore power to the farmhouse, installing a state-of-the-art solar generator as a backup system. By nightfall, Sarah had electricity, hot water, and for the first time in years, all the lights in the house working simultaneously. "We can replace these with energy-efficient models next week," said the lead engineer, examining the ancient appliances in Sarah's kitchen. "The solar array will be installed on the eastern slope, out of sight from the main house but perfectly positioned for maximum exposure." Sarah simply nodded, overwhelmed by the rapid pace of change. The house that had felt so empty for so long now bustled with purposeful activity. The morning after the convoy's arrival, a tow truck had retrieved Sarah's broken-down pickup from the roadside stand, returning it to the farm completely repaired by afternoon. "Water pump was shot, transmission needed rebuilding, and we replaced the timing belt while we were at it," the mechanic explained, handing Sarah the keys. "Should run like new now." When Sarah asked for an invoice, the man shook his head. "Already taken care of by the Harrington Foundation, Mrs. Harrington's orders." A temporary office had been established in Sarah's rarely used dining room, complete with computers, printers, and a satellite internet connection that the technicians assured her was faster than anything available in the county. David had taken up residence in this command center, coordinating the initial phases of the transformation with businesslike efficiency. "We've scheduled the soil analysis for tomorrow," David informed Sarah as they shared breakfast on the third day. "The water quality team arrives this afternoon, and the sustainable irrigation specialists will be here by the weekend." Sarah stirred her coffee, still adjusting to the strange new reality. "Seems like you've thought of everything," David smiled. "That's our job, thorough planning, efficient execution. Though I admit we typically apply these skills in corporate restructuring rather than farming." "What happens when this initial phase is complete?" Sarah asked. "Will you move on to another project?" David looked surprised. "I'm assigned to this location for the full year. Mother wants continuity of leadership, and given our unique connection, she felt I was the right choice." "A full year?" Sarah echoed. The thought of no longer being alone on the property brought mixed emotions, relief, but also apprehension. "Is that a problem?" David asked, noticing Sarah's hesitation. Sarah shook her head. "Just unexpected. It's been just me for so long. Your privacy will be respected," David assured her. "The plans include renovating the caretaker's cottage. For my use, you'll maintain complete autonomy in your home." Later that morning, Sarah stood at the edge of her fields, watching as a team methodically examined each section, documenting conditions on tablets and marking certain areas with colored flags. A woman in professional attire approached, extending her hand. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Amara Patel, agroecologist from the Harrington Sustainable Farming Initiative. I'm leading the field assessment." Sarah shook her hand. "What exactly are you looking for?" "We're identifying the strongest production areas, particularly your heritage varieties," Dr. Patel explained. "The blue flags mark areas that will serve as seed-saving sources, the green are prime producers, and yellow indicates sections that need rehabilitation. Red, unfortunately, marks those too depleted or damaged to save." Sarah noticed very few red flags, which relieved her. "And the purpose of all this categorizing?" Dr. Patel's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. "We're creating a comprehensive restoration and expansion plan. Your farm has some remarkable heirloom varieties, vegetables rarely seen in commercial production. The Cherokee purple tomatoes are particularly impressive, and these blue lake green beans must be from an original Line. Planted by my grandmother in 1967, Sarah confirmed. They were her favorites. They're magnificent, Dr. Patel said sincerely. With proper care and seed-saving protocols, we can preserve these genetics indefinitely. As the assessment team continued their work, Sarah made her way to the roadside stand, which had stood empty since the storm. To her surprise, she found a crew there as well, reinforcing the structure, expanding its roof, and installing display refrigeration. David mentioned you wanted to maintain the stand for direct sales, explained the project supervisor. We're upgrading it while keeping the rustic charm. Local customers appreciate that authentic connection to the farm. Sarah ran her hand along the familiar wooden counter, now sanded smooth and sealed against the elements. My mother built this with lumber from a barn that stood on this land for 100 years. We know, the supervisor said. That's why we're preserving as much of the original structure as possible, just making it more functional and weather-resistant. By mid-afternoon, Sarah found herself standing before the farmhouse with an architect who was explaining proposed renovations with animated gestures. The foundation needs reinforcement on the west corner, and the roof should be completely replaced. But the structure itself is remarkably sound for its age, the architect said, flipping through detailed plans. We'd like to restore the original woodwork, replace the windows with energy-efficient models that maintain the historic appearance, and update the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving their character. Sarah struggled to process the scope of changes being proposed. This must be costing a fortune, the architect smiled. The foundation has dedicated significant resources to this project, Ms. Mitchell. Mrs. Harrington believes the investment will pay dividends for generations. That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset, Diva joined her, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. Thought we might celebrate the official launch of the Willow Creek Farm Sustainable Agriculture Center, David said, pouring a glass of wine for each of them. If that's all right with you. Sarah accepted the glass. Seemed surreal hearing it called that. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping the wine as the sun painted the fields in gold and crimson. I received word this afternoon, David said eventually. The Johnsons accepted our offer for the adjoining property. Escrow will close in 30 days. Sarah nodded, trying to imagine her modest farm expanded to more than twice its current size. It was good land before they let it go fallow, rich soil, good drainage. The rehabilitation plan estimates it will be producing commercially within 18 months, David informed her. And the first class of farming apprentices will arrive in 60 days, once the initial facilities are complete. So soon? Sarah asked. Surprised. There's substantial demand for the program, David explained. People seeking a new path, a connection to the land. Many struggle with conventional employment, veterans with PTSD, people in recovery, former inmates reintegrating into society. Working with growing things provides purpose, tangible results, and a supportive community. Sarah thought about this. Michael used to say that farming taught patience and faith. You plant and nurture crops that might fail for a dozen reasons, beyond your control. It's an act of hope, believing in a future you can't guarantee. David nodded. That's exactly the perspective many people need, focusing on what can be cultivated, not what's been lost. The conversation turned to practical matters, the schedule for the coming weeks, the equipment that would be arriving, the plans for expanding the irrigation system. Sarah listened, occasionally offering insights about the land's peculiarities, which areas drained poorly after heavy rain, which slopes caught the earliest spring sunshine, which sections had the deepest topsoil. As darkness fell, lights came on automatically around the property, another new addition that startled Sarah briefly. Motion sensors and timers, David explained. Part of the security upgrades. Sarah shook her head in wonder. Never thought I'd see the day when Willow Creek Farm had security lighting. My grandfather would have considered it an extravagance beyond imagining. What do you think he would make of all this? David asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. Initially, he'd be suspicious. Samuel Mitchell didn't trust change or outsiders easily. She smiled at the memory of her grandfather's stubborn nature. But once he understood the purpose, preserving the farm, sharing sustainable methods with others, he'd come around. Might even pretend the whole thing was his idea all along. David laughed. Sounds like a few executives I've known. Sarah stood at the edge of the newly expanded farm, watching with quiet satisfaction. At her side was David, now a permanent fixture at the center, tablet in hand as he supervised the day's operation. We'll exceed last year's yield by at least 40%, David reported, reviewing the harvest data. The irrigation improvements and organic soil amendments are paying off faster than projected. Sarah nodded, still amazed by the transformation a year had brought. Where once she had struggled alone to maintain 12 acres of struggling crops, now 30 acres flourished under the care of trained apprentices and agricultural specialists. The original Willow Creek Farm had been carefully rehabilitated, with depleted areas restored and heritage varieties preserved through meticulous seed saving. Modern growing techniques had been implemented with respect for traditional methods. The heirloom tomato section looks particularly good this year, Sarah observed, gesturing toward plants now robust and heavy with fruit after expert rehabilitation. Dr. Patel says they're some of the healthiest specimens she's documented in the region, David replied. The companion planting program has virtually eliminated tomato blight without chemical treatments. They walked together through the fields, Sarah occasionally stopping to inspect vegetables or offer guidance to the farming apprentices. Each member of the program greeted her with respect, often seeking her opinion on ripeness or asking questions about particular varieties they were harvesting. "Miss Mitchell, is this eggplant ready to pick?" asked Carlos, a veteran in his second training season. He held up a glossy purple vegetable for her inspection. Sarah took the eggplant, examining it with the expertise of generations. "Another 2 days," she advised. "Look for more uniform color and a slight give when you press gently." She demonstrated the technique, then returned the vegetable to him. "Remember, they become bitter if harvested too late, so timing is crucial." Carlos nodded, absorbing the lesson. "I'll mark this section for Thursday's harvest then." As they continued their tour, Sarah and David passed the new processing facility, a sleek, energy-efficient building that had replaced the dilapidated shed Sarah had used for decades. Through its windows, Sarah could see crates of vegetables being prepared for distribution to organic markets, food banks, and the local farmers markets where Willow Creek Farm produced now commanded premium prices. "The first shipment to the Veterans Rehabilitation Center goes out tomorrow," David noted. Their nutritionist is particularly excited about the heirloom varieties. "Michael would have loved that," Sarah said softly. "He always believed in the healing power of good food." Beyond the original farm, new plantings stretched across what had once been the Johnson property. Unlike the varied crops of Sarah's family land, these were specialized sections designed for maximum efficiency, a model of sustainable, high-yield organic farming. It was a striking visual contrast, the traditional and innovative coexisting and complementing each other. "The first harvest from the new section exceeded expectations," David reported. "The apprentices are particularly proud of that achievement. They planted every one of those rows." As they approached the farmhouse, Sarah paused to take in the full view of the property. The house itself had been carefully restored, maintaining its historic character while incorporating modern efficiencies. The peeling paint and sagging porch had been replaced with historically accurate colors and sturdy craftsmanship. Solar panels, nearly invisible from this angle, provided power for the entire operation. Behind the house stood new buildings that blended seamlessly with the rural aesthetic, dormitories for program participants, classrooms and training facilities, and a community center where apprentices gathered for meals and social support. What had once been Sarah's lonely homestead was now the heart of a thriving community. Hard to believe it's the same place, Sarah mused. David nodded in agreement. Yet you can still feel the Mitchell family legacy in every corner. They continued toward the expanded roadside stand, now a popular destination for locals and tourists alike. The simple wooden structure Sarah's mother had built remained at its core, carefully preserved and integrated into a larger farm store that featured not only fresh produce, but also value-added products, pickles, dried herbs, tomato sauce, and jams made from Willow Creek Farm harvest. A line of customers waited patiently to purchase the day's offerings. Sarah recognized some as regular patrons who had supported her modest stand during the lean years, while others were newcomers drawn by the center's growing reputation. Inside the store, apprentices staffed the registers and helped customers select vegetables best suited to their needs. Sarah noticed Elena, a former addict who had arrived at the center with severe anxiety, confidently explaining the flavor profiles of different tomato varieties to a young family. When she'd first joined the program, Elena had barely spoken and avoided eye contact. Now she smiled easily as she slipped an extra tomato into the children's bag, much as Sarah had once done for the elderly Jenkins couple. Elena's applying to manage the new satellite store in Riverdale, David told Sarah quietly. The selection committee meets next week, but her case manager thinks she's ready. Sarah watched the interaction with pride. More than ready, I'd say she knows these vegetables better than some who've grown them for years. They moved past the store to the processing kitchen, where another team of apprentices transformed imperfect vegetables into shelf-stable products using equipment Sarah could never have afforded on her own. The rich scent of simmering tomato sauce filled the air as the modern kitchen hummed efficiently. Production is up 25% from last month, reported Susan, the facility manager and a retired teacher looking for a second career. We've secured 2 new distribution contracts for the organic sauce, including that high-end grocery chain in the city. Sarah sampled the fresh sauce, nodding her approval. Perfect balance of herbs. Michael's recipe is serving you well. Susan beamed at the compliment. We framed his handwritten recipe card in the kitchen. Reminds everyone that we're continuing a tradition, not just operating machinery. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah and David completed their circuit of the property, ending at the small garden overlooking the farm. Michael's memorial marker remained in its peaceful spot beneath the ancient oak tree, but it was no longer surrounded by an atmosphere of loss and struggle. Instead, it stood as an honored cornerstone of the thriving enterprise that had grown from Sarah's act of kindness. A simple stone bench had been placed nearby, offering a place for reflection. Sarah sat, taking in the panoramic view of the transformed farm as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Elizabeth is arriving tomorrow for the anniversary celebration, David reminded her, joining Sarah on the bench. She's bringing several potential funders for the expansion project. Sarah nodded. The proposed expansion would add another training center on the recently acquired neighboring property, doubling the program's capacity. Still planning the heirloom vegetable tasting in the Mitchell Legacy Garden? Weather permitting, David confirmed. Dr. Patel has prepared information on each variety's history and significance. Your grandmother's Blue Lake beans are the centerpiece, of course. Sarah smiled at the thought. Samuel Mitchell had been notoriously protective of those bean plants, believing they produced the finest green beans in the state. Now his pride and joy would be celebrated by agricultural experts and a new generation of farmers. As the harvest day wound down, apprentices began making their way back to the main facilities, carrying the last of the day's picking. Their voices drifted up the hill, conversations and occasional laughter blending with the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. A year ago today, Sarah said reflectively, I was about to lose everything. The farm, the house, all of it slipping away despite every effort I made. David nodded, remembering their first encounter. And now, Sarah continued, now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. She gestured toward the thriving operation below them. Not just the material improvements, though those are significant. It's the purpose, the community, the knowledge that my family's legacy continues in a way that matters. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sunset bathe the farm in warm light. Eventually, David spoke again. You know, I've been thinking about something you said when we first met. When I asked why you were giving away food, you couldn't afford to lose. You said it wasn't a handout. It was what Michael would have done. Sarah remembered the moment clearly, meant every word. I've come to understand something important about giving and receiving, David continued. Thoughtfully. When you helped me, a stranger you thought was in need, you weren't just offering food. You were offering dignity, respect, acknowledgement of worth. Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. That's how Michael always saw it. Giving isn't about the thing itself. It's about recognizing our common humanity. The apprentices who come through this program learn that lesson, David said. They arrive focusing on what they lack, jobs, skills, direction. They leave understanding what they have to offer, strength, resilience, purpose. Your kindness that day created a template for what we're building here. Below them, lights began coming on around the property as dusk deepened. The apprentice dormitory glowed with warmth, and the main facilities hummed with activity as the day's harvest was processed and stored. I never could have imagined all this, Sarah admitted, gesturing to the vibrant operation before them. When I gave you those vegetables, I was just doing what felt right in the moment. That's the power of simple kindness, David replied. We never know how far its ripples will reach. As darkness settled over Willow Creek Sustainable Farm, Sarah and David made their way down the hill toward the community dining hall, where the apprentices and staff gathered each evening for a shared meal. The conversations paused briefly as Sarah entered, then resumed with increased warmth and energy, several apprentices calling out greetings or updates on their day's work. Sarah took her usual place at the head of the main table, surrounded by the community that had formed around her family's land. As she looked around at the faces, some still bearing visible scars of hard times, others marked by less visible wounds, all showing the positive effects of purposeful work and supportive community, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. The simple act of sharing food with a hungry stranger had multiplied beyond imagination, transforming not just her own circumstances, but creating ripples of healing and opportunity that would continue long after she was gone. Willow Creek Farm had been saved not just as a business or property, but as a living legacy of compassion and service, a fitting tribute to Michael's generous spirit and her family's dedication to the land. As the meal began, Sarah caught David's eye across the table and raised her glass in a subtle toast to kindness freely given with no expectation of return, and to the unexpected bounty it sometimes yields. The anniversary celebration exceeded everyone's expectations. What had been planned as a modest ceremony marking 1 year since the establishment of the Willow Creek Sustainable Farming Center became a community-wide event, drawing hundreds of visitors from across the county and beyond. Sarah stood slightly apart from the main gathering, observing the festivities with quiet amazement. The farm was filled with people enjoying guided tours, vegetable picking demonstrations, and cooking classes. Local businesses had set up booths, offering everything from artisanal cheese to handcrafted kitchen tools, creating a festive atmosphere reminiscent of the harvest celebrations her father had described from decades past. Quite the turnout, Elizabeth Harrington remarked, joining Sarah beneath the shade of a massive oak tree. She had arrived that morning with a delegation of foundation officials and potential program funders, all of whom were now dispersed throughout the property, witnessing firsthand the program's success. Never seen anything like it, Sarah admitted. "Not even in the farm's heyday." "People are drawn to authentic purpose," Elizabeth observed. "What's happening here represents something genuine in a world that often feels manufactured." Sarah nodded, watching as an apprentice led a group of visitors through the heritage vegetable section, explaining the history and significance of each variety with evident pride. The young woman, Sarah recalled her name was Jasmine, had arrived at the center 5 months ago, withdrawn and uncertain after escaping an abusive relationship. Now she spoke with confidence and enthusiasm about cultivation techniques that had been passed down through generations of the Mitchell family. As they walked together toward the central pavilion, Sarah spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd, a tall man in business attire, whose bearing immediately identified him as someone important. It took Sarah a moment to recognize him without the usual news cameras surrounding him, but when she did, her heart skipped a beat. Senator Robert Collins, the state's most powerful political figure and chairman of the Agricultural Committee. Before Sarah could approach him, David was calling everyone to gather for the official ceremony. The pavilion, a graceful structure of timber and stone that complemented the rural setting, filled rapidly as people took their seats. On a screen at the front, photographs documented the center's remarkable first year, before and after images of the farm's rehabilitation, apprentices working together to plant new crops, community events, and harvests that had exceeded all projections. David stepped to the microphone, and the crowd quieted expectantly. 1 year ago today, he began, the Willow Creek Sustainable Farming Center existed only as a concept, a possibility born from a simple act of kindness. Today, we gather to celebrate what that seed of compassion has grown into. He proceeded to outline the center's accomplishments, 28 apprentices successfully completing the initial training program, with 75% continuing in agricultural careers. A harvest that had exceeded projections by 30%. Community partnerships that had created additional opportunities for program participants. And plans for expansion that would double their capacity in the coming year. But statistics and achievements tell only part of the story, David continued. The true measure of our success lies in the lives that have been changed, the apprentices who have found purpose and healing. Among these fields, the community that has embraced our mission, and the legacy of service that continues to guide everything we do. Several apprentices shared their experiences. One by one, they stepped forward to describe their journeys, the challenges they had faced, the isolation they had felt, and the sense of belonging and purpose they had discovered at Willow Creek Farm. Before I came here, I couldn't see a future for myself, admitted Alina, the former addict who now managed the farm store. Now I know exactly where I'm headed and why it matters. Elizabeth spoke briefly about the program's significance within the larger context of the Harrington Foundation's mission. As she finished, she surprised Sarah by calling her to the microphone. None of this would exist without Sarah Mitchell, she said simply. Her compassion when faced with someone in need, despite her own significant challenges, created the foundation for everything we're celebrating today. Sarah approached the microphone reluctantly, unaccustomed to public speaking. Looking out at the expectant faces, she cleared her throat nervously. I'm not one for speeches, she began, her voice quiet but steady. My husband Michael used to say that actions speak louder than words, and that's how I've tried to live my life. What happened here wasn't because of anything special about me. It was because of something my parents and Michael taught me, that kindness isn't an extra thing we do when life is easy. It's the essential thing that helps us all survive when life is hard. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts as she looked over the transformed farm that had been her family's legacy for generations. A year ago, this farm was failing. I was failing. I couldn't see a path forward. When I gave some vegetables to a hungry man, she nodded toward David, it wasn't a calculated decision. It was just the right thing to do in that moment. I never expected anything in return. Her gaze moved to Elizabeth. When that motorcade pulled up my driveway the next morning, I thought I was dreaming. I couldn't believe my simple act of kindness could lead to anything so extraordinary. Sarah gestured toward the apprentices seated in the front rows. But looking at all of you now, seeing what you've accomplished here, I understand something important. Kindness isn't just about the giver and receiver. It creates connections that extend far beyond that initial moment. What began with a box of vegetables has become something that will continue to bear fruit, literally and figuratively, for generations to come. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. My husband Michael faced his illness with courage, always thinking of others even in his darkest moments. This center honors his spirit of service far better than I could have imagined. Sarah looked directly at David. Mr. Harrington arrived at my stand looking like a homeless man, but he was actually conducting research. He was testing our community's response to those in need. Most people had walked right past him. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't walk past. She turned back to the audience. That's the lesson I hope this center teaches everyone who comes here. Don't walk past someone in need. Even if you have little to give that little with an open heart. You never know how far those ripples might reach. As Sarah stepped away from the microphone, the pavilion erupted in applause. She returned to her seat slightly embarrassed by the attention, but moved by the genuine response. After the ceremony concluded, people dispersed throughout the property to continue the celebration. Sarah found herself approached by well-wishers and congratulated by people she'd known her entire life, many of whom had never before set foot on her land. The sense of community surrounding the farm was palpable, a dramatic change from the isolation she had experienced for so many years. As the crowd thinned, Sarah noticed Senator Collins standing near the Heritage Vegetable Garden, examining a Cherokee purple tomato with interest. She made her way over, her heart pounding with unexpected nervousness. "Senator Collins," Sarah called as she approached. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. Welcome to Willow Creek Farm." The senator turned, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been hoping to meet you. This is quite an operation you've built here." They shook hands, and Sarah felt a surge of pride at his words. "Thank you, Senator, though I can't take credit for most of it. The Harrington Foundation has been the driving force." "Don't sell yourself short," the senator replied. "Elizabeth Harrington told me the whole story. This place exists because of your character, your willingness to help a stranger when it cost you something to do so." Sarah was saved from having to respond by Elizabeth's arrival. "I see you two have found each other," she said, joining them beside a row of heirloom tomatoes. "I was just telling Ms. Mitchell how impressed I am with what you've accomplished." "Here," Senator Collins said. "When you first approached me about the Agricultural Innovation Grant, I was skeptical. But seeing this," he gestured to the thriving farm around them, "I'm convinced." Sarah looked at Elizabeth in confusion. "Agricultural Innovation Grant?" Elizabeth smiled. "I was going to surprise you during the funding announcement later, but since the senator brought it up, Willow Creek has been selected as the primary site for a new federal initiative supporting sustainable farming practices. It comes with a $5 million grant over 3 years. Sarah stared at her, speechless. "Your farm will serve as a model for others across the country," Senator Collins explained. "The techniques you're developing here, water conservation, organic pest management, heirloom seed preservation, these are exactly what American agriculture needs to move forward sustainably. The grant includes funding for 10 satellite training centers," Elizabeth added, "spreading the Willow Creek model to communities that need it most." I don't know what to say," Sarah stammered. "Say you'll come to Washington next month to speak before the Agricultural Committee," the senator suggested. "Farmers respect other farmers far more than they respect politicians. They need to hear your story from you." Before Sarah could respond, David approached with a group of foundation board members, eager to show the senator the new processing facility. As they walked away, Sarah remained rooted to the spot, trying to process this latest development. A year ago, she had been a failing farmer on the verge of losing everything. Now she was being asked to speak before a Senate committee about agricultural innovation. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she stood in the midst of its reality. "Takes some getting used to, doesn't it?" said a voice beside her. Sarah turned to find Elena, the apprentice turned manager, holding a basket of freshly harvested vegetables. "What does?" Sarah asked. "Having your life completely change direction," Elena replied with a knowing smile. "One day you're just trying to survive, and the next you're part of something bigger than yourself." Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in the young woman's words. "Exactly like that. You know what I tell myself when it all feels too overwhelming?" Elena continued. "I remember something you taught us during our first week here. You said, 'We plant seeds we may never see grow, but that doesn't mean they won't become forests someday.'" Sarah smiled, remembering Michael's words that she had passed along. "Wise man, my husband." "Wise woman, his wife," Elena countered, before moving off to help an elderly visitor navigate the uneven ground. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself observing the celebration from different vantage points around the farm: the hilltop where Michael was buried, the porch where she had first heard the Harringtons' proposal, the edge of the field where she had worked alone for so many years after his death. From each perspective, the transformation seemed more remarkable. What had once been her solitary struggle was now a vibrant community of purpose. What had once been a dying family farm was now at the forefront of agricultural innovation. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration was winding down, Sarah found herself standing beside the roadside stand where it had all begun. The simple wooden structure her mother had built had been beautifully restored and expanded, but its heart remained the same: a place of direct connection between those who grew food and those who needed it. David joined her there, a quiet presence at her side. "Penny for your thoughts," he said after a moment. Sarah gestured to the stand. "I was just thinking about how it all started here. If you hadn't walked by that day, if I hadn't had vegetables to share, if you hadn't been the kind of person who shares even when it costs you something," David added. Sarah nodded. "So many ifs. My father had a saying about that," David said. "Coincidence is just God's way of remaining anonymous." Sarah smiled. Michael would have agreed with him. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the last visitors made their purchases and headed to their cars. Among them, Sarah spotted the Jenkins, the elderly couple who had been her loyal customers through the worst times. Mrs. Jenkins was carefully selecting tomatoes from a display that now overflowed with abundance rather than the meager offerings of a year ago. Sarah walked over to them. "Those are on the house today," she said warmly. "Consider it a thank you for all the years you kept coming back when there wasn't much to buy." Mrs. Jenkins embraced her. "We're so proud of you, dear." Samuel and Elaine would be bursting with pride to see what's become of their farm. "And Michael," Mr. Jenkins added softly. "He always said this place was meant for more than just growing vegetables." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for remembering him." As the Jenkins departed, Sarah returned to David, who was speaking on his phone. He ended the call as she approached. "That was Mother," he informed her. "The board has unanimously approved the expansion funding. Construction on the new training center can begin next month." Sarah took a deep breath, looking out over the farm that stretched before them, fields that now flourished with life and purpose, buildings that hummed with activity, people who had found new beginnings among the rows of vegetables her family had tended for generations. "Your father would be proud," she said simply. "His foundation has created something remarkable here." David shook his head. "The foundation provided resources, but you, Sarah, you provided the heart. Never forget that." Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the property had quieted, Sarah sat alone on her porch. The night was clear, stars spreading across the sky in a dazzling display that had always made her feel small yet connected to something infinite. She thought about the journey of the past year, from desperation to abundance, from isolation to community, from merely surviving to truly thriving. None of it had been planned or expected. All of it had grown from a single moment of choice, the decision to share what little she had with someone who seemed to have nothing. Michael had always told her that the most important decisions in life weren't the big, dramatic ones, but the small daily choices that revealed character. We become who we are in the moments when no one is looking, he would say. When there's nothing to gain but the knowledge that we did what was right. Sarah hadn't known David was watching that day. She hadn't known the Harrington Foundation existed, or that her simple act of sharing would set in motion events that would transform not just her farm, but her entire community. She had simply done what felt right in the moment, what Michael would have done, what her parents before him would have done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, speaking in Washington, expanding the training program, spreading the Willow Creek model across the country. The ripples of that one act of kindness continued to expand in ways Sarah could never have imagined. But tonight, sitting on the porch of the home she had nearly lost, surrounded by the land her family had tended for generations, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The future that had once seemed so bleak now stretched before her, full of possibility and purpose. From inside the house, she heard the gentle chime of the old clock that had belonged to her grandmother, a steady heartbeat marking time in a home that once again felt alive. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to its familiar rhythm, and allowing herself to feel gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her here. Tomorrow would be soon enough to think about Senate committees and expansion plans. Tonight was for remembering, honoring the path that had led to this moment and the simple truth that Michael had always tried to teach her: we keep what we give away. The soft spring breeze carried the scent of freshly turned soil and growing things, the eternal promise of renewal that had sustained farmers since time immemorial. Sarah breathed it in deeply, feeling connected to all those who had worked this land before her and all those who would continue its legacy long after she was gone. The seeds she had planted, both literal and metaphorical, would continue to grow, nourishing body and spirit in ways she might never fully witness. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest harvest of all. 1 year after the anniversary celebration, Sarah Mitchell stood before the Senate Agricultural Committee in Washington, D.C., her hands steady despite her nervousness. The grand chamber, with its polished wood and formal procedures, was a far cry from the muddy fields of Willow Creek Farm. But Sarah carried the essence of those fields with her, practical wisdom earned through decades of working the land. "Senators, I'm not a policy expert or an economist," she began, her voice clear and confident. "I'm a farmer. For 3 generations, my family has worked the same piece of land, weathering droughts and downpours, boom markets and foreclosure notices. What I've come to share with you today isn't just my story, but the story of what happens when we recognize that the health of our land, the health of our communities, and the health of our economy are inseparably linked." Senator Collins, now her champion in Washington, nodded encouragingly from his seat at the committee table. Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah described the Willow Creek model, how the integration of sustainable farming practices, community involvement, and skills training had not only saved her family farm, but transformed it into a thriving center of innovation and opportunity. What began with an act of kindness has become a blueprint for rural revitalization, Sarah explained, showing slides of the farm's transformation. "In just 2 years, we've trained over 60 people in sustainable farming practices. 80% have found employment in agriculture or food production. Our vegetable yields have increased by 40% while using 30% less water. And we've preserved 23 heirloom vegetable varieties that might otherwise have been lost to commercial standardization. The senators asked pointed questions about costs, scalability, and practical implementation in different regions. Sarah answered each with the straightforward clarity of someone who had lived the reality she described. When asked about the economic impact, Sarah didn't just quote numbers. She told stories of Elena, the former addict who now managed 3 farm stores; of Carlos, the veteran who had developed an organic pest management system now being adopted by farms across the state; of Jasmine, the domestic violence survivor who had become the center's most effective educator and advocate. These aren't just success stories, Sarah emphasized. They're examples of what happens when we invest in people and places that conventional economics has written off as lost causes. As the hearing concluded, Senator Collins approached the podium where Sarah stood gathering her notes. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. "You've convinced several members who were on the fence. I think we'll get the full funding package for the national expansion." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mingled with disbelief. 20 farms across the country, she said, still struggling to grasp the scale. From one small act of kindness. The senator smiled. "That's how the most important changes often begin, isn't it? Not with grand gestures, but with someone simply doing what's right when it would be easier not to." That evening, as Sarah prepared to return home, she received a call from David at the farm. After exchanging brief updates, he said, "There's someone here who'd like to speak with you," and passed the phone to a voice Sarah didn't recognize. "Ms. Mitchell? My name is Aaron Delaney. I started the apprentice program yesterday." "Welcome to Willow Creek, Aaron," Sarah said warmly. "How are you finding it so far?" There was a pause before the young man spoke again. "I wanted to tell you. 3 months ago, I was living in my car. Lost my job, lost my apartment, was running out of options. Someone at the shelter told me about your program." Sarah listened, hearing the emotion in his voice. "When I arrived yesterday, and they showed me to my room, a real room with a bed and a window that looks out on growing things, I couldn't believe it. And then at dinner, you know what happened? People asked me questions about myself. Like they actually wanted to know me, not just what I could do for them." "That's the Willow Creek way," Sarah said softly. "I know your story, Ms. Mitchell. How all this started because you helped someone who looked like they had nothing to offer in return. I just wanted you to know, that ripple you started, it reached me. And someday, I hope to pass it on to someone else." After ending the call, Sarah stood at her hotel window overlooking the capital city, lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow she would meet with foundation executives and government officials to finalize plans for the national expansion. The day after, she would fly home to the farm that had nearly slipped through her fingers 2 years ago. But in this quiet moment, Sarah held close the words of the young man who had found his way to Willow Creek Farm. One more life touched by a chain of events that began with a simple box of vegetables shared with a stranger on a rainy afternoon. Some harvests, Sarah reflected, couldn't be measured in bushels or dollars. Some ripples continued to spread long after the initial stone had been cast into the water. And sometimes, the greatest legacy we leave isn't what we build or save or accomplish, but the moments of kindness that inspire others to do the same. That, perhaps, was the truest meaning of wealth, not the $20 million estate that had saved her farm, but the immeasurable riches of lives transformed by compassion, freely given and gratefully received. 5 years after that fateful afternoon when Sarah Mitchell had shared her last vegetables with a seemingly homeless stranger, Willow Creek Farm had transformed into something beyond even Elizabeth Harrington's ambitious vision. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a national movement, with Sarah at its unexpected center. The morning sun filtered through the new greenhouse, a marvel of sustainable engineering that extended the growing season through the harsh winters. Sarah walked slowly between rows of seedlings, each tiny green shoot representing hope and possibility. Behind her followed a group of international visitors, agricultural ministers from 3 developing countries, eager to learn how the Willow Creek model might be adapted for their regions. The key innovation isn't technological, Sarah explained, gently touching a delicate tomato seedling. It's philosophical. We've reconnected farming with its true purpose, not just producing food, but nurturing communities and healing landscapes. One of the ministers, a thoughtful woman from a drought-stricken African nation, nodded in understanding. In my country, we have forgotten the wisdom of our ancestors, who knew how to farm with nature, not against it. Exactly, Sarah agreed. At Willow Creek, we found that blending traditional knowledge with modern science creates resilience. These heirloom varieties, she gestured to a section of rare vegetable seedlings, have genetic traits developed over centuries that help them withstand challenges that often overwhelm modern hybrid crops. As they continued the tour, Sarah felt a familiar sense of wonder at how far things had come. The original 12-acre struggling farm had expanded to 200 acres of thriving fields, orchards, and educational facilities. Where once she had worked alone, fighting a losing battle against debt and despair, now over 100 people found purpose and community in the daily rhythms of sustainable agriculture. The international delegation moved on to the research building, where Dr. Patel, now heading a team of agricultural scientists, was developing drought-resistant farming techniques. Sarah excused herself, checking her watch. The Founders' Day celebration would begin in an hour, and she wanted a few moments of quiet reflection before the festivities commenced. Making her way to the hilltop where Michael's memorial stone stood. Beneath the ancient oak, Sarah found David already there, gazing out over the sprawling farm. In the 5 years of their partnership, his initial 1-year commitment had evolved into a permanent role as the center's executive director. Together, they had navigated the challenges of rapid growth while maintaining the heart and soul of what made Willow Creek special. "I thought I might find you here," David said, making room for her on the stone bench. "Pre-celebration contemplation?" Sarah smiled, settling beside him. "Something like that. Days like today make it impossible not to think about how it all began." They sat in companionable silence, watching the bustling activity below. Staff and apprentices were putting final touches on decorations for the celebration that would commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Willow Creek Sustainable Farming Initiative. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years since Mother and I showed up in your driveway," David observed. "Harder still to believe I almost packed up and left that morning," Sarah admitted. "I was so certain foreclosure was inevitable that I'd started deciding what few possessions I could fit in my truck." David turned to her, surprised. "You never told me that." Sarah shrugged. "Some stories only make sense to tell after they've fully unfolded." She gestured to the thriving operation spread out before them. "And this one is still unfolding in ways I never could have imagined." The Willow Creek model had now been replicated in 32 locations across the country, from former coal mining towns in Appalachia to struggling desert communities in the Southwest. Each center adapted the core principles to local conditions and needs, but all shared the same fundamental approach, using sustainable agriculture as a vehicle for economic revitalization, community building, and personal transformation. "Your Founders' Day speech ready?" David asked. Sarah patted her pocket where several carefully written pages rested. "As ready as it'll ever be. I still find it strange that people want to hear me talk. I'm much more comfortable with my hands in the soil than at a podium." "That's precisely why people listen," David said. "You speak from lived experience, not theory. In a world full of carefully crafted messages, authenticity stands out." The sound of vehicles arriving drew their attention. Among the first was a sleek electric car that Sarah recognized immediately, Elizabeth Harrington had arrived. At 75, Elizabeth remained actively involved in the foundation's work, though she had gradually transitioned day-to-day operations to David and a board of directors. "We should head down," Sarah said, rising from the bench. "Your mother will want to see everything before the crowds arrive." As they descended the hill, Sarah paused for one last look at Michael's memorial stone. "I wish you could see this," she whispered. "You were right all along. The farm was meant for something more." The celebration area buzzed with activity. A large tent had been erected in the central courtyard, surrounded by displays highlighting the center's achievements and the stories of those whose lives had been transformed by their time at Willow Creek. Farmers markets from across the region had sent representatives, creating a festival atmosphere with stalls of local produce, crafts, and food. Elizabeth greeted Sarah with a warm embrace. "My dear, everything looks magnificent. Richard would have been so proud to see what his foundation's resources have accomplished in your hands." "The resources were essential," Sarah acknowledged. "But it's the people who have made this place what it is." She gestured to the gathering crowd of current and former apprentices, staff members, and community supporters. Each one has added something unique to Willow Creek's story. As they moved through the celebration area, Sarah was repeatedly stopped by people wanting to share how the center had impacted their lives, former apprentices who now ran their own farms, local business owners whose livelihoods had been revitalized by the increased tourism and commerce the center had brought to the region, families who had found community and purpose through the center's educational programs. Among them was Alina, now agricultural director for 3 Willow Creek satellite centers across the state. "Just got the funding approval for the urban farming initiative," she reported excitedly. "We'll be breaking ground on the first neighborhood gardens next month." "That's wonderful," Sarah said, genuinely delighted. Alina's journey from addiction to leadership exemplified everything Willow Creek stood for: the belief that everyone deserved a second chance and that meaningful work connected to the earth could heal even the deepest wounds. Carlos approached, proudly introducing his new wife and infant daughter. "We've named her Sarah," he said shyly. "Hope that's okay." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked at the tiny bundle. "It's more than okay. It's the greatest honor." The ceremony began with David welcoming everyone and introducing the various dignitaries in attendance. Senator Collins, now chairman of the Agricultural Committee, representatives from several international aid organizations, leaders from other Willow Creek centers across the country, and a special guest whose identity had been kept secret from Sarah. "Before we hear from our founder," David announced, "I'd like to introduce someone whose story exemplifies the ripple effect of compassion that lies at the heart of our mission. Some of you may recognize him from his work leading the Urban Hunger Initiative in Chicago. Please welcome Aaron Delaney." Sarah stared in amazement as a confident young man approached the podium. The scared, hesitant apprentice who had called her from the farm 5 years ago had transformed into a poised leader. "5 years ago," Aaron began, "I was living in my car, with no hope and no future. Today, I direct a program that has helped over 3,000 families in Chicago's food deserts gain access to fresh, nutritious produce grown in community gardens tended by formerly homeless individuals." He turned to face Sarah directly. None of this would exist without Sarah Mitchell's original act of kindness. Not just what she did for David Harrington, which led to the creation of this center, but what the center did for me when I arrived broken and hopeless. At Willow Creek, I didn't just learn how to grow vegetables. I learned how to grow a life worth living. Aaron's powerful testimony was followed by a video montage showing the evolution of Willow Creek and its satellite centers. Barren fields transformed into abundant gardens, abandoned buildings renovated into community spaces, and most importantly, people finding their way back from various forms of despair through the healing power of purposeful work and supportive community. When it was finally Sarah's turn to speak, she approached the podium with her prepared remarks. Looking out at the sea of faces, people whose lives had become intertwined with hers through this improbable journey, she quietly folded the paper and set it aside. 5 years ago, she began, I stood at the edge of losing everything. The farm that had been in my family for generations was about to be foreclosed. My truck had broken down. A storm had canceled the farmer's market that was my last hope for making the mortgage payment. I was alone, broke, and without options. Sarah paused, remembering the desperation of that day. And then a man who appeared to be homeless walked up to my nearly empty farm stand. I had so little left to give, just some vegetables that represented my last chance at paying my bills. But in that moment, something Michael, my late husband, had always said echoed in my mind. We don't give because we have plenty. We give because we know what it means to have nothing. She looked directly at David, seated beside his mother in the front row. I didn't know then that the homeless man was actually David Harrington conducting research for his family's foundation. I didn't know my small act would set in motion events that would transform not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others. I simply did what felt right in the moment, what my heart told me was the human thing to do. Sarah gestured to the thriving farm around them. People often ask me what the secret is to Willow Creek's success. They want to know about our organic growing methods, our educational programs, our community building strategies. All of those are important. But the true foundation of everything we do is much simpler. We recognize the inherent value in every person and every piece of land, no matter how broken or depleted they may appear. As long as there's soil and seed and someone willing to bring them together with care, there's hope. After bidding Aaron goodnight, Sarah continued to her farmhouse, the same structure that had once been on the verge of foreclosure, now beautifully restored while maintaining its historic character. Inside, photographs of 5 generations of Mitchell farmers lined the walls, with newer images added showing the evolution of Willow Creek into a center of innovation and healing. Settling under her porch with a cup of tea, Sarah gazed out at the farm that had been saved by what appeared, on the surface, to be extraordinary good fortune, the coincidental arrival of the Harrington Foundation's $20 million. But Sarah knew the deeper truth. The fortune hadn't been the beginning of Willow Creek's transformation. It had been a response to something more fundamental, a choice made from the heart when there was nothing to gain. In that sense, real miracle wasn't the money at all. It was the recognition that even in our darkest moments, we retain the capacity for compassion. That when we give freely from whatever we have, be it wealth or wisdom, time or talent, produce or presence, we participate in a sacred exchange that transcends ordinary transaction. The cool night air carried the scent of growing things, the eternal promise of renewal that had sustained farmers since time immemorial. Sarah breathed it in deeply, feeling connected to all those who had worked this land before her and all those who would continue its legacy long after she was gone. The seeds she had planted, both literal and metaphorical, would continue to grow, nourishing body and spirit in ways she might never fully witness. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest harvest of all. Up next, we've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.